The morning Harriet Dugan walked into the Caldwell County Courthouse. The dust on her boots was still wet from the creek she had forded at dawn, and the deed clutched in her right hand was wrinkled from where she had pressed it against her chest all night long, afraid to let go of the only proof that the land her husband had died to work still belonged to her and her son. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat at the edge of everything. The last real town before the cattle trails pushed south into Indian Territory, a place where fortunes were made and stolen with equal enthusiasm, where the courthouse bell rang at 8 each morning, as if civilization itself needed reminding that it had arrived on the frontier. The street outside was already alive with the clatter of wagon wheels and the low calls of drovers pushing a small herd through before the heat of the day set in. The smell of cattle and sawdust and horse sweat drifted through the courthouse's open windows along with the warm April air, and Harriet noticed none of it. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of steady hands that came from years of hauling water and kneading bread dough before sunrise. She was not a woman given to trembling, but her knees were trembling now as she climbed the 3 broad stone steps and pushed through the heavy oak door. Beside her, holding her left hand with both of his small ones, was her son Thomas. He was 7 years old, freckled and solemn, wearing his good shirt that she had ironed by lamplight the night before, because she had wanted whoever they met today to understand that they were people of dignity, regardless of what had happened to them. What had happened to them was a man named Clyde Rourke. Rourke was the wealthiest landowner in the county, a cattle baron who had arrived in Caldwell 3 years prior with enough money to buy influence and enough cunning to parlay that influence into a network of favors that reached from the local sheriff all the way to the county land office. He had wanted the Dugan property from the moment he laid eyes on it, 240 acres of prime bottomland along the Cimarron, with water rights that never ran dry even in drought years, the kind of land that could anchor a cattle empire if it was added to the 3,000 acres Rourke already held to the east. Harriet's husband, Earl Dugan, had refused to sell. Earl had been a stubborn, good-hearted, plain-spoken man who had broken that land himself with a team of oxen and 14-hour days, and he had told Rourke in the middle of the feed store, loud enough for 6 witnesses to hear, that he would rather be buried on that land than hand it over to a man who had never done an honest day's work in his life. 2 months later, Earl was dead from what the county doctor had called a rattlesnake bite, though Harriet had never found a snake, and the bite had been on the back of his calf in a place a man would have had to be lying down to receive it. She had cried her grief out in 3 days because she could not afford more than 3 days, and then she had gone back to work. The trouble had come 6 weeks after Earl's burial, in the form of a document delivered to her door by a man from the land office named Purvis, who had removed his hat and spoken with the careful sympathy of someone who expects to be screamed at. He had informed her that a deed of prior claim had been filed showing that Earl Dugan had sold his land rights to Clyde Rourke 8 months before his death, that the sale had been witnessed and notarized, and that she had 30 days to vacate. Harriet had looked at that document for a long time. Then she had gone to her own strongbox and pulled out every paper Earl had ever put in it, and she had found her deed, her original deed, filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1878, bearing the proper seals, showing the full property lines, with Earl's name on it and no lien or encumbrance of any kind. She had also found, tucked behind it, a letter Earl had written her in the style of a man who did not entirely trust the world to be fair. It was not quite a will. It was more of an accounting, a list of everything he owned, and a statement in his plain handwriting that everything he had belonged to Harriet and their boy, and that no man had ever persuaded him otherwise, and no man ever would. She had read that letter 4 times, and then she had packed her best dress and her son's good shirt and the deed and the letter into a flour sack, and she had ridden the 30 miles to Caldwell on her husband's old roan horse, forded the creek at dawn, and walked into the courthouse. The clerk at the front desk was a thin young man named Abbott who looked at her with the mild irritation of someone who has already decided how his morning will go and does not appreciate interruptions. She asked him for the county land registry, and he told her, without looking up from his ledger, that disputes of that nature were handled by the county attorney's office, room 7, end of the hall. She thanked him politely and walked down the hall with Thomas's hand in hers, counting the doors. Room 7 had its door standing open. The man inside was sitting at a desk that was buried under a landslide of papers and law books, writing something with intense concentration, his dark brown hair falling slightly across his forehead in a way that suggested he had been at that desk since before anyone else had arrived. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with a broad-shouldered frame that looked slightly incongruous behind a lawyer's desk, as if his body had been built for some other occupation that his mind had overruled. His jacket was hung on the back of his chair, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows. He had ink on his left hand, and the kind of focused expression that made Harriet hesitate for half a second in the doorway before she raised her fist and knocked on the doorframe. He looked up. His eyes were a very clear, steady gray, and when they met hers, they did not flicker away the way some men's eyes did when they looked at a woman who had arrived looking like she needed something. They settled on her with full attention and stayed there. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, unhurried in the way of a man who had learned that the faster you spoke in a courtroom, the less people listened to you. "Can I help you?" "I am looking for the county attorney," Harriet said. "My name is Harriet Dugan. I have a land dispute." He rose from behind his desk. He was taller than she had gauged from the doorway, and when he looked down at Thomas, he did not do it with the performed cheerfulness adults sometimes used on children. He looked at the boy the way he had looked at Harriet, directly, with genuine curiosity. "Jedediah Weston," he said, extending his hand to Harriet. "I am the county attorney. And who is this?" "Thomas," said Thomas before Harriet could speak, with the forthright manner of a child who has been told that introducing yourself properly is important. "Thomas Dugan," Jedediah Weston said, shaking the boy's hand as seriously as if he were a client. "That is a fine name. Come in, both of you. Please sit down." He cleared papers from the 2 chairs across the desk, stacking them in a tower on the floor that immediately looked precarious, and Harriet and Thomas sat. She placed the deed on the desk in front of him. She placed Earl's letter beside it. She looked at Jedediah Weston, and she told him everything, starting from Earl's refusal to sell and ending with the document Purvis had brought to her door. She spoke clearly and without interruption, and she watched him read both documents while she talked, his eyes moving between her and the papers with that steady, absorbing attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He turned Earl's letter over in his hands as if weighing it, then set it down carefully. "This deed you've brought me," he said, "was properly filed with the territorial office in Guthrie. In 1878, I have the filing number on the back." He looked. He was quiet again. "Mrs. Dugan," he said, "the document Rourke filed claiming prior purchase, do you know when it was notarized?" "Purvis told me December of last year, 4 months after Earl died." Something changed very slightly in Jedediah Weston's gray eyes. It was not dramatic. It was more like a door closing quietly in a house where a decision has been made. "That is interesting," he said, "because a deed of sale for land already held under a territorial filing would need to have been notarized by the territorial office, not the county notary. The county notary in Caldwell has no standing to certify a transfer of federally registered land." Harriet stared at him. "Are you saying the document Rourke filed is fraudulent?" "I am saying it has procedural problems that a territorial court would not overlook." He paused. "I am also saying that I would like to take this case, Mrs. Dugan." She had already opened her mouth to ask what his fee would be because she had to know if she could afford it or if she would have to do this some other way, and the words were forming themselves on her tongue when he held up one hand. "I take no payment for cases of this nature," he said. "I never have." She closed her mouth. She looked at him for a long moment. "Explain what you mean by that," she said, because she was a practical woman and she had learned to be suspicious of anything that sounded like charity, because charity in her experience usually came wrapped around something that cost more than the charity itself. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a small, steady expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "I mean exactly what I said. My father was a homesteader. He lost his land in Illinois to a man with better lawyers and more money when I was 11 years old. We lived in a tent for 2 winters. I passed the bar in 1875 in Topeka, and I have been in Caldwell since 1879. And the one condition I have kept for myself since I opened this office is that if a case involves a family's home being taken from them by someone with more power than right, I do not charge for it. You can pay me in nothing, and that is what I ask." Harriet looked at him for a moment longer. Thomas was looking at him too, with the focused assessment of a child who takes adults seriously and expects them to merit it. "All right," Harriet said at last. "Then we accept." What followed was 3 weeks of the most complicated and exhausting legal maneuvering that Harriet had ever witnessed. And she witnessed most of it because Jedediah Weston had the habit of explaining everything he was doing and why, sitting across from her at his desk, or at the small table in the back room of the courthouse where he kept his files, speaking in that unhurried way of his, while Thomas sat on the floor nearby drawing horses in the margins of papers Jedediah had already used and set aside. The core of the case was a challenge to the authenticity of Rourke's deed of prior purchase. To prove the document was fraudulent, Jedediah needed to establish 3 things: that the territorial filing of 1878 took legal precedence over any county-level notarization, that the notarization on Rourke's document was procedurally defective, and that the notary who had signed it, a man named Belden who worked out of the county clerk's office, had done so either without proper authority or under duress or inducement. The first 2 points were purely legal, and Jedediah pursued them with the quiet, methodical determination of a man who has absolute confidence in the logic of an argument, even when the human beings around that argument are corrupt. The third point required investigation, and that was where things became complicated. Belden had left Caldwell the week after Harriet received the eviction notice. No one in town seemed to know where he had gone, though several people mentioned, with careful vagueness, that he had come into some money around the time of his departure. Jedediah filed the legal paperwork with the territorial court in Topeka by telegraph and post, engaging a colleague there to handle the physical filings, and while that worked its way through the system, he turned his attention to finding Belden. Harriet helped him, because she could not afford to sit still. She was staying at the Caldwell boarding house run by a Mrs. Fulton, a large and kind woman who had heard pieces of Harriet's story from Abbott, the courthouse clerk, and had given her a room at half price with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has made that kind of decision before and does not regret it. Thomas slept in the same narrow bed as Harriet, curled against her back, and she lay awake some nights thinking about her chickens and her vegetable garden, and whether the man Rourke had sent to take possession of the property was watering her tomato seedlings. She was fairly sure he was not. She began asking questions in the way that a woman can ask questions that a man sometimes cannot in the dry goods store, at the water pump, at the laundry. She was looking for anyone who had seen Belden in the days before he left, anyone who had spoken to him, anyone who might know where he had gone. What she found, after 5 days of careful conversation, was a woman named Clara Potts who ran the laundry on 2nd Street and who had washed Belden's shirts for 3 years and who said, with the frank directness of a woman who has already decided that keeping quiet about injustice is no longer something she is willing to do, that Belden had told her he was going to his sister's place in Wichita, that he had looked like a man who was scared down to his boots and trying not to show it. and that the last shirt she had washed for him had a letter folded into the breast pocket that she had not read but had noticed was addressed to Clyde Rourke. Harriet brought this to Jedediah. He listened to every word and wrote it down. Then he sent a telegram to the Wichita City Attorney's office, a man he had known from his years in Topeka, asking him to locate a man named Belden at the address of his sister and to take a sworn deposition from him if at all possible. In the meanwhile, Rourke was not idle. He came to the courthouse on the second Tuesday after Harriet's arrival, and he came the way powerful men come to places where their authority is being questioned, with two men flanking him, big men in good boots who stood by the door without being asked. Rourke himself was 50 years old, heavyset, with a thick gray mustache and the permanently sunburned complexion of a man who spent his working life outdoors despite his wealth. He was not an unintelligent man, which made him more dangerous than a stupid one. He went directly to Jedediah's office, and he spoke to Jedediah with the particular brand of courteous aggression that very powerful men deploy when they want to make clear that they are being gracious, by not yet exercising the full weight of their power. Harriet was in Jedediah's office when Rourke arrived, sitting in one of the chairs across from the desk, while Jedediah reviewed the territorial filing documentation with her, and the fact of her presence made something flash very briefly in Rourke's eyes before he smoothed it away. "Weston," Rourke said, sitting himself in the other chair without being invited, ignoring Harriet the way very powerful men sometimes ignore people they would prefer to not exist. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about the Dugan property. The deed of sale is perfectly in order, and I would hate to waste the court's time over a simple paperwork matter." "The deed you filed," Jedediah said, with the same measured, pleasant tone he seemed to maintain regardless of what was happening around him, was notarized by a county notary on property that was registered with the Territorial Land Office. That is not a paperwork matter. That is a jurisdictional matter, and the Territorial Court in Topeka takes a serious view of it. Rourke looked at him for a moment. "The widow has already been notified that she has 30 days to vacate. Those 30 days expire next week. The 30-day notice has no standing while a territorial court challenge is in process," Jedediah said. "That is statutory law, Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Dugan's property is protected by judicial stay until the territorial court rules on the validity of your filing." Rourke turned his head and looked at Harriet then, fully, for the first time. His expression was not threatening. That was the thing about men like Rourke, Harriet thought. They did not need to threaten. They simply looked at you with the absolute certainty of a man who has never, in the whole of his life, lost anything he set his mind to keeping, and the certainty itself was the threat. "Mrs. Dugan," he said, "your husband was a proud man. I respected that even when it made things difficult. But pride is a luxury for people who can afford it. You have a boy to raise. I'm offering you $800 for a clean transfer of deed. That's more than the property is worth on the market, and you know it." Harriet looked back at him. She thought about Earl. She thought about the 2 oxen and the 14-hour days and the 2 winters she and Earl had spent living in their wagon while they built the house with their own hands. She thought about the letter in the strongbox with Earl's plain handwriting telling her that the land was hers and that no man had ever persuaded him otherwise. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Rourke," she said. "No." He studied her for one more moment, then stood. He nodded to Jedediah with the minimal courtesy of a man storing a grievance for later use, and he walked out, and his 2 men fell into step behind him, and their boots on the wooden floor of the hallway sounded like something being counted out. When they were gone, Jedediah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," Harriet said. $800 is not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." She looked at him. "Do you think we can win this?" He met her eyes with that steady gray gaze of his. "I think we can win this," he said. "I want you to know that even if we win in the territorial court, Rourke has enough money to appeal and delay, and that could mean 6 months to a year before you are completely clear. During that time, you cannot be removed from your property, The stay prevents that, but the pressure will not stop." Harriet nodded. She had already understood this. It was the kind of understanding that settles into you not as a thought but as a weight somewhere below the breastbone, and you simply carry it and keep moving. "Then we have a long road ahead of us," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not quite the professional assessment of a lawyer regarding a client, something quieter and more personal than that, before he looked back down at his papers. "We do," he said. Thomas had come in at some point during the exchange with Rourke and had stood near the bookcase, very still in the way that children who have learned to be invisible in difficult situations are still. And Harriet had been aware of him there the way she was always aware of him, the way a mother knows the location of her child, the way a compass knows north. Now Jedediah looked over at Thomas and said, "You all right, son?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Who was that man?" he asked. Jedediah looked at Harriet briefly. "A man who wants something he does not have the right to take," he said. Thomas thought about this. "What happens to men like that? When things work the way they should," Jedediah said, "the law stops them." Thomas looked at him with those steady brown eyes so like his mother's. "And what happens when the law does not work the way it should?" Jedediah was quiet for a second. "Then somebody has to make sure it does," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not boastful. It was more like a statement of personal policy, made in the same tone a carpenter might say that a joint ought to be square. That evening, after Harriet had fed Thomas at Mrs. Fulton's table and gotten him into bed and watched him fall asleep with his face pressed into the pillow in the deeply abandoned way of children who have spent their energy completely, she sat in the small chair by the window and thought about Jedediah Weston. She was not a woman who thought about men in that way, or had not been for a long time, since Earl, really, since the early days of their marriage when she had still been the kind of person who had room in her attention for things beyond what needed to be done next. Earl had been a good man, and she had loved him in the practical, deeply rooted way of people who have shared hard work and hard winters, and his absence was a real and permanent ache, the kind that does not announce itself every moment but is simply always there, the way a missing tooth is always there. She was not looking for anyone. She was not the kind of woman who looked for anyone. She had land to reclaim and a boy to raise and about $40 in her flour sack, and those were the facts of her situation. But she thought about the way Jedediah Weston had shaken Thomas's hand like a man deserving of respect. She thought about the explanation he had given her of his reasons for taking no payment, simple and direct, and without any performance of virtue. He had told her about his father and the tent, and the 2 winters, the way you tell someone a thing that shaped you, not the way you tell them something you want credit for. She thought about the way he looked at her when she said no to Rourke's $800, not with admiration exactly but with recognition, the way you recognize something in another person that corresponds to something in yourself. She closed the window against the night chill and told herself to go to sleep. The next morning she arrived at the courthouse before 9 and found that Jedediah was already at his desk, as she had expected, and that he had a pot of coffee on the small iron stove in the corner of his office, which he poured for her without being asked, which she accepted without being surprised, and they sat across from each other with the Dugan deed and a stack of territorial land law documents between them and went to work. This became the pattern of the following days. She came in the morning, Thomas with her, and they worked through the legal material together, Jedediah explaining the statutes, and she absorbing them with the focused intelligence of someone who had always been a quick study, but had spent most of her life in circumstances where that intelligence had been applied to problems other than the law. At noon she took Thomas to the lunch counter on Main Street and fed him, and in the afternoon she went back and worked until the light shifted and the courthouse clock struck 5. Jedediah stayed long after 5. She knew this because on 2 occasions she had forgotten her shawl and come back to retrieve it, and found him still at his desk. surrounded by the specific kind of concentrated disorder that productive lawyers live in. On the third occasion she came back for her shawl, she also brought him a plate from Mrs. Fulton's table, because Mrs. Fulton had noticed what Harriet was doing and had set aside an extra portion with the benign efficiency of a woman who considers it her personal mission to ensure that people who are doing important things do not forget to eat. Jedediah looked at the plate and then up at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and something warmer. "You did not have to do that," he said, which was the second time he had said those words to her, and Harriet recognized the repetition. "I know," she said, which was the same thing she had said before, and something about the echo of it made them both quiet for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the specific electric stillness that sometimes exists between two people who are only beginning to understand what they are to each other. She left before that stillness could become anything more, and walked back to the boarding house in the warm April dark with her heart beating somewhat faster than walking at a moderate pace requires. The reply from Wichita came on a Thursday, 17 days after Harriet had arrived in Caldwell. It was a telegram from Jedediah's colleague, a brief one, reading, "Belden located, willing to speak, coming Friday on afternoon train, have him Tuesday at latest." Harriet was in the office when the telegram arrived, delivered by a boy of about 12 who took the coin Jedediah offered him with a quick, bright-eyed assessment of the room and its occupants before vanishing. Jedediah read the telegram and handed it to Harriet without comment. She read it and looked up. "He is coming," she said. "He is coming," Jedediah agreed. "What does that mean for the case?" "It means that if Belden testifies that he notarized the document under duress or financial inducement, we have grounds for criminal fraud in addition to the jurisdictional defect. It means Rourke faces not just a civil challenge in territorial court, but a potential criminal referral to the federal prosecutor." Harriet set the telegram down on the desk. She was thinking about Earl again, about the bite on the back of his calf and the snake they never found. She was thinking about whether justice for a dead man could be achieved by a land case, or whether it only lived in the knowing. "Will this be enough to stop Rourke completely?" she asked. "Not just delay him, but stop him?" Jedediah looked at her steadily. "If the territorial court accepts the jurisdictional challenge and Belden's testimony supports fraud, yes. Rourke could appeal, but his legal position would be very weak. A federal fraud charge would likely deter him from further pursuit." She nodded. She thought of the land and the house and the garden and the water rights and the creek. "Good," she said. Thomas was on the floor by the bookcase, where he spent most of his time now when he was not at the window watching the street. He had taken to pulling law books down from the lower shelves and paging through them with the dedicated incomprehension of a child who is more interested in the texture of knowledge than its content. Jedediah had, on the second day, shown him how to find the index of a law book and explained what an index was, and Thomas had spent an afternoon doing nothing but reading indexes, which had amused Jedediah deeply, or so Harriet had concluded from the way his eyes had lightened when he watched the boy work. That Thursday evening, Jedediah walked them back to the boarding house, which he had not done before. He had offered to, several times, in the evenings when the street outside was still active with the late commerce of a cattle town drovers coming in from the trail, the saloon on 4th Street releasing its noisy overflow, the occasional raised voice of some argument that was better had indoors but was being had outside anyway. Harriet had declined each time, because she was perfectly capable of walking 2 blocks unescorted, and she did not want to be the kind of woman who required escorting. But this evening Jedediah had said, "I need to speak to you about the court schedule, and I may as well walk with you," which was such an obvious pretext that Thomas had looked between the two of them with the particular knowing expression of a 7-year-old, who understands more than adults give him credit for. They walked the 2 blocks in the warm evening, Thomas between them at first, and then ranging a few steps ahead because there was a dog outside the hardware store that he wanted to investigate, and Harriet and Jedediah walked side by side in the space his absence created. "The court schedule is not what you actually wanted to discuss," Harriet said. Jedediah agreed without any pretense of surprise. "It is not." He was quiet for a few steps. The street was golden with late light, and the sound of the saloon piano drifted from a block away, slightly out of tune in the way all frontier saloon pianos were slightly out of tune, as if the territory itself imposed a particular melancholy on all musical instruments. "I wanted to ask you something that has nothing to do with the case." "Then ask it." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "How are you managing?" he said. "Not the legal situation. You, Thomas, are you all right?" The question was so direct and so genuine that it took her a moment to answer. She was accustomed to people asking how the case was progressing, or whether she had heard anything from Wichita, or whether Rourke's men had come around. Nobody had asked her that. "I am managing," she said. "I am tired. I miss my house." She paused. "Thomas is doing better than I am, which is both a relief and a little bit embarrassing." Jedediah made a sound that was almost a laugh, not the polite social kind but the involuntary kind that gets loose when something actually strikes you as funny. "He is an extraordinary child," he said. "He is," she agreed. "He is very much like his father." She said it without the usual cautionary grief she felt when talking about Earl in front of strangers, because Jedediah was not exactly a stranger anymore, and the words came out steadier than she expected. "Tell me about him," Jedediah said, "if you want to." She told him about Earl, not the story of the land dispute, which Jedediah already knew, but the actual person, the way Earl had looked when he was laughing, which he had done often despite the hard work, the way he had taught Thomas to fish before Thomas could hold a rod properly, and had spent most of that afternoon with his hands over the boys' small ones guiding the line. The way Earl had been embarrassingly bad at cards but had refused to stop playing, because he maintained that persistence was the same as skill if you applied it long enough. The way he had died too young and too suddenly, and she had not had time to say goodbye, and she had never fully reconciled herself to that. Jedediah listened to all of it without interruption, which was something she was finding to be one of his most unusual qualities. The capacity to listen to a person speak without filling the spaces they needed to breathe in. They had reached the boarding house by then and stood on the step while Thomas, having finished his conversation with the hardware store dog, came running back to them with the slightly dramatic breathlessness of a child who runs everywhere. "I will see you tomorrow," Harriet said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He looked at her for a moment in the last of the evening light, in that way he had of looking at her that she was increasingly unable to categorize as merely professional. Then he touched the brim of his hat, not quite a tip, more of a quiet acknowledgement, and turned and walked back down the street, and she stood on the step and watched him go longer than was strictly necessary. Belden arrived on the Friday afternoon train, a small, anxious man of about 50 with the look of someone who has been frightened for an extended period, and is not entirely sure the frightening has stopped. Jedediah's colleague from Wichita, a stocky man named Forsyth who wore a very fine vest and treated legal proceedings with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never lost a case he considered winnable, came with him and sat in the corner of Jedediah's office while the deposition was taken. Harriet was asked to wait in the hall. She stood there for 40 minutes with Thomas, who spent the time conducting a quiet examination of the hallway's woodwork with his small fingers, assessing the joints and gaps with a focused attention that made her wonder if he would grow up to be a carpenter or a detective. When Jedediah came to the door and called her back in, Belden was sitting in his chair looking both diminished and strangely relieved, the way people sometimes look after they have said the thing they have been keeping in, and found that the act of saying it did not destroy them. Jedediah sat across from her at his desk with a sheet of paper in front of him, and a particular quality of controlled calm that she recognized as the version of him that had just gotten something important. Belden's deposition stated that Rourke had come to him in November of the previous year with a document already prepared, purporting to be a deed of sale between Earl Dugan and Rourke, and had asked him to notarize it. When Belden had pointed out that the document was backdated to a period before Earl Dugan's death, and that he could not in good conscience notarize a document he had not witnessed being signed, Rourke had offered him $300, and the strong implication that men who made difficulties for Clyde Rourke in Caldwell County tended to find that Caldwell County became very uncomfortable for them. Belden had taken the money and signed the notarization and had been afraid ever since, and when Jedediah's colleague had arrived at his sister's house in Wichita and explained that his testimony could both protect him from prosecution and put an end to the fraud, Belden had agreed almost before Forsyth had finished the sentence. The deposition also stated something else. It stated that the document Rourke had brought had already had Earl Dugan's signature on it when Belden received it, and that the signature did not look to Belden like any signature he had seen Earl Dugan make in all the years he had known him. It was too careful, too labored, in a way that suggested it had been copied rather than written. Belden had thought about that, he said, and he had thought about the manner of Earl Dugan's death, and he had not allowed himself to think too hard about either because he was afraid. But he was saying it now. He was saying it on the record. Harriet sat very still while she read Belden's deposition. Thomas was beside her, and he was still too, in that way he had. When she looked up, Jedediah was watching her with an expression that was careful and kind and giving her time. "This is enough," she said. Her voice was steady. "This is enough to take to the territorial court." "Yes," he said, "and the federal prosecutor." She thought about the bite on the back of Earl's calf and the snake they never found. "On the question of Earl's death," she said. "Is there anything? The deposition raises serious doubt about the authenticity of the signature," Jedediah said, gently but directly. "Whether Earl's death was something other than what was ruled is a matter for the sheriff, and I will bring this to his attention. The sheriff here has been in Rourke's pocket, but with a federal fraud charge on the table he will find his pockets less comfortable." He paused. "I cannot promise you justice for Earl, Harriet. I can promise you that this will be heard." It was the first time he had called her by her first name. She noticed it, and she could see that he noticed that she noticed it, a brief flicker in his expression, and neither of them said anything about it. "All right," she said. "Then let us hear it." The territorial court in Topeka moved faster than Harriet had dared hope, which Jedediah attributed to the clear-cut nature of the jurisdictional defect and the quality of the deposition. Within 12 days of Belden's testimony being filed, the territorial court issued a ruling declaring Rourke's deed of prior purchase legally void on jurisdictional grounds, finding that the county notary had no standing to certify a transfer of federally registered land, and that the document had therefore never constituted a valid conveyance. Harriet's original 1878 filing was confirmed as the sole valid deed of record. The ruling came by post on a Wednesday morning, and Jedediah read it twice to himself and then brought it to the boarding house rather than waiting for Harriet to come to him, which she understood. When he arrived at Mrs. Fulton's door with that careful stillness in his face that meant something important had happened, to mean that he had not been able to wait. She read it at the kitchen table while Mrs. Fulton, who had been making bread and had the flour on her hands to prove it, stood near the stove and did not pretend she was not interested in what was happening. Thomas was at the table with a bowl of oatmeal that he had stopped eating in favor of watching his mother's face. When she finished reading, Harriet sat for a moment. Then she put the paper down flat on the table and pressed both palms on it, feeling the paper under her hands, and she said, "It is over. The fraud charge will follow separately," Jedediah said. "Rourke can still appeal the civil ruling, but with Belden's testimony supporting fraud, his legal position is—" "Jedediah," she said. He stopped. "It is over." He looked at her across the table, and the morning light was coming through Mrs. Fulton's kitchen window and landing in the way spring light in Kansas lands, warm and new and slightly unbelievable after a long winter, and something in his face shifted in the way something shifts in a person when they allow themselves to feel the thing they have been holding at careful distance. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is over." Thomas looked at his mother. Then he looked at Jedediah. Then he went back to his oatmeal with the satisfied air of someone whose expectations have been confirmed. Harriet spent that day in a kind of moving calm, making arrangements for the return journey, settling her account with Mrs. Fulton, who accepted the payment with a warm handshake, and the observation that Harriet Dugan was the most capable woman she had met in 3 years of running a boarding house, and she was welcome back any time. She sent a wire to her neighbor Martha Colby, whose husband had been watching over the property as well as his conscience allowed given the circumstances, telling her she was coming home. She bought Thomas a peppermint stick from the dry goods store, and he ate it with the solemn enjoyment of a child who has waited for something long enough that it tastes like both the thing and the waiting. In the late afternoon, she went to Jedediah's office alone, because Thomas was at Mrs. Fulton's with strict instructions to stay and assist with the chickens that Mrs. Fulton kept in her backyard, which Thomas had accepted as a serious commission. Jedediah was at his desk writing, but he looked up when she came in and he stayed looking up. She sat in the chair across from him and put her hands on the desk in the direct way she had, not folded, just resting there, and she looked at him. "I want to say something to you," she said. "Then say it," he said. "What you did for me, for us. I want you to know that I understand it was not only about the law. I know that. You believe in a thing and you acted on it, and you did not pretend it was something other than what it was. That kind of honesty is rare." She paused. Earl was honest in the same way, plain and full and without calculation. I had forgotten that such people exist, and I am glad to be reminded. Something moved across his face that was complex and quiet and real. "You and Thomas are welcome to remind me any time," he said, and his voice was a little lower than usual. She looked at him. The afternoon light in the office was amber and thick, the kind of light that makes the world look like something painted rather than something real. The stack of law books on the desk was the same as it had always been, the slight smell of ink and old paper, the sound of the street outside. She thought about the 30 miles of road she had ridden at dawn 4 weeks ago and the creek she had forded and the deed pressed to her chest. She thought about the fact that she was about to go back to her land and her house and her garden and her chickens, and that once she did, she would see this man again only if there was a reason. "I am leaving tomorrow morning," she said. "I know," he said. "Will you come and see us?" she asked. "Thomas asks about the creek. He would like to show you where the best fishing is." She watched him understand what she was actually saying, and she watched him be careful with it, which was the right response, because she was a woman who had been careful herself and who respected carefulness in a person. "I would like that very much," he said. She stood up to leave, and then she stopped. She had not planned to do what she did next, but she had learned in the 4 weeks she had spent in this office that some things should not be planned. She reached across the desk and she took his hand, the one with the ink on it, and she held it for a moment. His hand was large and warm and entirely still in hers. He looked up at her from that stillness. "Thank you, Jedediah," she said. He turned his hand so that it was properly holding hers, and he said, "It was my honor, Harriet." And the word honor sounded in his voice the way it sounds in the voice of people who mean it without ceremony. She let go of his hand, and she walked out of the office into the amber afternoon, and she walked back to Mrs. Fulton's to collect her son and her flour sack and her deed, and she did not look back down the hall, though she thought about it. Harriet and Thomas rode home the following morning on the old roan horse that had waited patient and uncomplaining at the Caldwell livery stable for 4 weeks, eating good oats at Harriet's expense. The road was 20 miles of open prairie and 10 of creekside trail, and the morning was clear, and the grass was very green in that particular aggressive way of Kansas spring grass, and Thomas rode behind her with his arms around her waist and talked the whole way about law books and the hardware store dog, and whether Jedediah Weston would really come to see the creek. He said he would, Harriet told him. "I believe him," Thomas said, in the simple way of children who have not yet accumulated enough disappointment to hedge their faith. The land was exactly as she had left it, which should not have surprised her but did. The house was intact. Rourke's man had apparently done nothing more than walk through it and then leave. There was a boot print on the kitchen floor that was not hers or Thomas's or Earl's, and she cleaned it with cold water and a rag, with the focused deliberateness of someone removing an insult rather than a stain. The vegetable garden was somewhat overgrown, and her tomato seedlings had died for lack of water, which made her briefly and genuinely furious before she reminded herself that she could plant again. The chickens were with the Colby family next door, and Martha Colby brought them back that afternoon with a pie and a long embrace, and the slightly tearful expression of a woman who has been very worried and is very relieved. The creek ran along the western edge of the property, clear and quick with snowmelt, exactly the way it always had. Harriet went down to it that first evening after Thomas was in bed and stood on the bank in the last of the light and listened to the water. She thought about the deed in her strongbox. She thought about Jedediah Weston at his desk with the amber light falling on the ink stains on his hand. She thought, "I have time." For the first time in a very long while, she had time. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, a rider came up the road from the south, and Harriet was at the water pump when she saw him coming and recognized the way he sat a horse straight-backed and easy, not quite a cowboy's seat but close to it, the seat of a man who had grown up riding and had never entirely forgotten it. She recognized the broad shoulders and the dark hair, and she did not hurry in the way she wanted to hurry but walked at a measured pace to the gate and opened it. Jedediah Weston rode in on a brown gelding and swung down from the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who has been on horseback since before he could read. He was not wearing his lawyer's jacket. He had on a plain cotton shirt and a vest, and his hat was a working man's hat, not the kind you wore to court. He looked different out here, she thought, less contained, as if the open sky gave him room to be more completely himself. Thomas came out of the house at a dead run and stopped himself with some effort just short of the gate, because he had been told not to run at people, and extended his hand with tremendous formality. Jedediah shook it with tremendous formality in return. "You said you would come," Thomas said. "I said I would come," Jedediah agreed. "The creek is this way," Thomas said, and turned and walked in the direction of the creek with the air of a man conducting an important tour. Harriet looked at Jedediah. He looked at her. The Kansas spring was enormous and blue all around them, and the grass was impossibly green, and the creek sang just beyond the stand of cottonwoods, and she was standing on her own land. "You came," she said. "I came," he said, and smiled, which was the first time she had seen him smile fully, not the almost smile or the adjacent to smile she had catalogued in those weeks in the courthouse, but the real version, and it changed his face in the way that full smiles change faces, opening something in it that is usually kept at a careful remove from the world. She smiled back. "Come see the creek," she said. They spent the afternoon at the creek, which was everything Thomas had promised it was, clear and quick and cold, running over flat limestone shelves that caught the light and threw it back in broken, shifting patterns. Thomas showed Jedediah the place where the big catfish held in the deep bend, and Jedediah listened with the seriousness of a man receiving important intelligence. And then he produced, from his saddlebag, a length of good fishing line and 2 hooks, and Thomas's expression was something Harriet wanted to hold in her memory for the rest of her life. She sat on the bank while they fished, her boots off, her feet in the cold grass, and she watched the two of them side by side at the water's edge, Thomas's small body and Jedediah's large one, the boy explaining the particular physics of catfish behavior in a tone of authoritative confidence, and the man listening and responding with questions that suggested genuine interest rather than performance. She thought about Earl again, not with grief this time but with something more like gratitude, that Earl had made this child who was so fully himself, so serious and bright and without pretense, and that she had not lost the land Earl had broken, and that there was a man at the edge of her creek who had made sure of that. The afternoon stretched long, the way spring afternoons in open country do, as if the light itself is reluctant to leave. Thomas caught a small catfish and released it with the ceremony of someone completing a religious obligation, and then promptly fell asleep on the bank in the way that 7-year-olds fall asleep outdoors, completely and without warning, as if someone has simply turned off a lamp. Harriet covered him with her shawl, and she and Jedediah sat on the bank nearby and talked in the low voices of people in the presence of a sleeping child. They talked about the land, about what she planned to plant, and whether the south field was worth trying for corn this late in the season. They talked about Caldwell, about a new land rights bill that was moving through the territorial legislature that Jedediah thought might strengthen protections for homesteaders, about whether the new sheriff's race, the current sheriff having quietly announced he would not be seeking re-election in the wake of the Rourke fraud proceedings, would bring someone more honest to the office. They talked about his family, his father's lost land in Illinois, the way his mother had taken in sewing to keep them alive through those 2 winters in the tent, the way she had told him that the law was supposed to be the thing that prevented what had happened to them and that he should go and make sure it was. "She sounds extraordinary," Harriet said. "She was," he said, and the past tense was so quiet and so settled that she did not ask, only nodded and let it rest. The sun was beginning to go orange in the west, and Thomas stirred and woke with a confused look that immediately resolved into the memory of exactly where he was and why, and he sat up and looked at the creek with satisfaction. "Did anything else bite?" he asked. "3 somethings," Jedediah told him, "but they were too fast for me." Thomas accepted this with the sympathy of an expert for a student. "You need to be more patient," he said. "I have been told that before," Jedediah said. Harriet caught his eye as she said that, and the smile was back at the corner of his mouth, and she looked away toward the creek before her own face could say too much. He stayed for supper. She cooked the simple thing she had been planning to cook anyway: salt pork and beans and cornbread from the good iron skillet that had been a wedding gift, and had outlasted everything else except the land. And they ate at the kitchen table where Earl had eaten 1,000 times before his death, and it did not feel wrong or complicated to have Jedediah there. It felt, in the honest, uncomplicated way of things that fit, as if the table had room for one more person and had always known it. After supper, Thomas was put to bed with the minimum of ceremony because he was already half asleep on his feet, and Harriet and Jedediah sat on the porch in the warm dark with cups of coffee, which she made strong the way she always made it, and listened to the creek and the frogs and the long Kansas night. "I have something to tell you," Jedediah said. She waited. "Rourke has agreed to the fraud settlement. Forsyth completed the negotiation this week. He will pay restitution to Belden. He will withdraw all claims on your property permanently, and he will sign a formal acknowledgement of the fraud for the court record. In exchange, the federal prosecutor agreed to a substantial fine in lieu of criminal trial." She was quiet for a moment. "No criminal trial," she said. "No criminal trial." Forsyth thought it was the better resolution given the cost and duration of a federal case, and the practical reality that Rourke's lawyers would have made it very long and very expensive for Belden, who is not a wealthy man. He paused. "But the acknowledgement of fraud is on the court record. It is public. And on the question of Earl's death, the sheriff in Caldwell, the new acting one, has agreed to reopen the inquest. I can make no promises about what that will find, but it will be looked at properly this time." She looked out at the dark. The frogs were very loud by the creek. "Earl," she thought. "Earl, they are looking." "Thank you," she said. It was a different thank you than the one she had said in his office 2 weeks ago with the amber light in his hand in hers. This one was simpler and deeper and did not require anything more. They sat in the quiet dark for a long while, not talking, just present, the coffee warm in their hands, the night wide and full around them. "I think about coming back here," he said eventually. She looked at him in the dark. "Do you? More than is probably appropriate for a county attorney with a full caseload." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "I think about Caldwell more than I used to." He turned his head and looked at her. The moon had come up and it laid silver along the top of the grass and caught the glint of the creek between the cottonwoods, and she could see his face clearly in it. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that we have been acquainted for 5 weeks and that I am recently widowed and that I have a son and a property to run and that you have a full caseload." She said it all plainly, the way she said everything. "I know all of that." And, he said, because he was a man who listened carefully and understood that there is always an and. "And I would like you to keep coming to see the creek," she said. He held her gaze for a moment in the moonlight, and something happened in his expression that was quiet and certain and complete. "That is something I can commit to with full confidence," he said, and his voice was warm with the smile that went with the words. He rode out at 9 that night. Because the road was good and the moon was up and 30 miles of open prairie was not a difficult night ride for a man on a decent horse. And Harriet stood at the gate and watched him go until the darkness took the shape of him, and there was nothing left to watch. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house, and she was not lonely, which surprised her, because she had been lonely for so long that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that is always there. She was not lonely because she was full of something else. She was not sure yet what to call it, but it was warm and it was real, and it sat in her chest like a light someone had lit and intended to keep burning. He came back 3 weeks later, and the week after that, and the week after that. By the third visit he was bringing Thomas books from the Caldwell Lending Library, which Thomas received with an expression of reverent seriousness. And by the fourth visit, he was helping Harriet repair the fence on the south pasture, working alongside her with the easy competence of a man who grew up on a farm and still carries the muscle memory of it, neither of them talking much because the work did not require it, and the silence between them was by now a comfortable thing, full of all the conversation that had already happened and all that was still to come. By the fifth visit it had become an unspoken habit that he would arrive on Saturday afternoon and leave Sunday morning after breakfast, sleeping in the narrow room off the kitchen that had been Earl's study, and that still had Earl's extra hat on the hook by the door, which Harriet had not removed and Jedediah had never commented on. Thomas had accepted these arrangements with the serene certainty of a child whose world has organized itself in a way that makes sense to him, and had begun, in the way children do, to simply include Jedediah in his accounts of daily life with the easy casualness of long acquaintance. In June, 3 months after Harriet had walked into the courthouse with the deed in her hand and Thomas's hand in hers, Jedediah came on a Saturday afternoon, and he had something in his expression that was different from the usual, something slightly less controlled, slightly more transparent, as if he had been thinking about this for a long time and had finally come to the point where thinking was no longer sufficient. They were walking along the creek after supper, the three of them, Thomas a little ahead turning over rocks to look at the creatures beneath in the methodical way of a naturalist conducting a survey, and Jedediah stopped walking. Harriet stopped too and looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, which was what she always said to him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about how to ask you in a way that does not seem impulsive or presumptuous given the circumstances, and I have come to the conclusion that there is no way to ask that is not impulsive and presumptuous, so I am simply going to ask and let you say whatever you need to say." She looked at him. The creek moved past behind him, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm evening air, and Thomas was 30 feet upstream turning over another rock with complete concentration. "Jedediah," she said. "I know the timing is not conventional," he said, with a kind of determined steadiness. "I know that Earl has not been gone 2 years and that people will have opinions about it. I am not asking you to disrespect his memory. I would never ask that. He made you and he made Thomas and the land you both love, and he deserves every part of the honor you hold for him." He paused. "But I love you, Harriet." I have loved you since the morning you walked into my office with that deed in your hand and told me the truth of your situation without asking for my sympathy, only my help. And I would like, if you will have me, to spend the rest of my life being the kind of man who is worthy of what you are." She stood still and let his words settle into her the way water settles into dry ground, not all at once, but finding all the channels that were waiting for it. She had loved Earl truly, and she had mourned him, and she would honor him always. She also knew, with the plain, clear-eyed honesty that was the deepest thing in her, that she loved Jedediah Weston. Not the way she had loved Earl, because she was not 23 years old on a borrowed farm anymore, and he was not Earl, and love between two people is always its own particular shape and not the shape of any other love. But it was love full and real and rooted in something that had grown in 5 months of working side by side and telling each other the truth. Thomas had turned around from his rock and was watching them with the alert stillness of someone who understands that something important is happening. "Thomas," Harriet said, "what do you think?" Thomas considered this with the gravity it deserved. He looked at Jedediah for a moment. "Will you still come to the creek?" he asked. "Every chance I get," Jedediah said. Thomas looked at his mother. "I think yes," he said simply. Harriet looked back at Jedediah, at his steady gray eyes in the evening light, at the ink stain she could still see faintly on his left hand from last week's brief paperwork he had brought with him, at the expression on his face that was careful and certain and completely without pretense. "Yes," she said. "Jedediah Weston, yes." The relief that crossed his face was almost tender in its completeness, the relief of a man who has been holding a careful, controlled hope for a long time and has just been told he can let it go. He reached out and took her hand the way she had taken his that afternoon in his office with full intention, turning it so it was properly held. Thomas watched this with satisfaction and then turned back to his rocks. They were married in August of 1882, in the small white Methodist church on the edge of Caldwell that Harriet had noticed when she first arrived in town and had thought, in the distracted way of someone focused on something else, had a nice bell. The bell rang on the morning of their wedding in a way that Harriet would remember for the rest of her life, clear and low, and carrying across the open country, the way bells do in the West where there is nothing to stop the sound. It was a small wedding. Mrs. Fulton came and brought a magnificent cake. Forsythe came from Wichita and was very pleased with himself in a way that was entirely forgivable. Martha Colby came with her husband and 3 children, and Thomas stood beside Jedediah with the careful seriousness of a best man conducting official duties. Jedediah wore his good suit and had gotten a haircut that was slightly too short and made him look younger than he was. And Harriet wore the blue dress she had sewn the week before from fabric she had chosen with the focused pleasure of a woman who has not bought fabric for herself in a long time. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, there was a moment of absolute silence in the small church, and then the bell tolled once as if the building itself were answering, and everyone laughed, and Harriet looked at Jedediah and he was laughing too, and she thought, "This is it. This is exactly the thing." After the ceremony, standing outside in the August heat, while Mrs. Fulton cut the cake and Thomas interrogated Forsythe about the specifics of the work settlement with the methodical thoroughness that would one day make him an excellent attorney, Jedediah stood beside Harriet with his arm around her, and he said quietly, "How does it feel?" She leaned slightly into him and looked out at the town, at the familiar dusty street and the courthouse at the end of it where all of this had begun, and at the open blue sky above everything. "Like home," she said. He pulled her a little closer. "Good," he said. "That is exactly how it should feel." They went back to the land. Jedediah maintained his practice in Caldwell, but moved his life to the Dugan property, riding the 30 miles to town on Monday mornings and back on Friday afternoons, which was an arrangement that suited everyone, and which also suited the people of Caldwell better than anyone had expected, because a county attorney who worked on Mondays through Fridays with the focused intensity of a man making up for a full weekend away from his desk, was a county attorney who got an extraordinary amount done. He kept taking cases for no payment when the case was a family's home being taken by someone with more power than right, and he kept winning most of them. And his reputation in the county became the particular kind of reputation that draws to it exactly the kind of cases he wanted to take. The widow with the irregular deed, the homesteader with the forged contract, the family evicted on a technicality by a man who owned the bank. He had a gift for it that was partly intelligence and partly something harder to name, some fundamental orientation toward fairness that expressed itself through the law the way certain musicians express something through a particular instrument, not because the instrument is the feeling, but because it is the best available tool for carrying it. Harriet ran the land. She planted the south field in corn and the east garden in vegetables, and kept the creek water rights clean and properly documented, and replanted the tomatoes that had died during her absence. She hired a hand named Flores, a young man who had come up from Texas with a cattle drive, and decided he preferred farming to droving, which was a decision Harriet respected, and which proved to be an excellent one for both parties, because Flores had a particular gift for growing things in difficult soil that complemented everything Harriet already knew. Thomas thrived. He had Jedediah's books now, boxes of them brought from Caldwell over successive Fridays, and he read everything he could lay his hands on with the consuming hunger of a child who has discovered that the world is much larger than the world immediately around him, and is determined to understand all of it. He helped Flores in the East Garden, and helped his mother with the accounts, and helped Jedediah, on the weekends, with the preparation of simple legal documents that Jedediah used as teaching tools. By the time Thomas was 9, he could read a land deed and identify its essential components with more accuracy than most adults in the county. Jedediah adopted Thomas formally in October of 1882, 2 months after the wedding. The paperwork was filed in the same courthouse where they had first met, which struck Harriet as the right kind of symmetry, and afterward Jedediah had taken them both to the lunch counter on Main Street and bought Thomas a piece of apple pie, and told him that the Weston name was his if he wanted it, and that he could make whatever choice he liked on the matter, because it was his name and his life, and the name mattered less than the intention behind it. Thomas had thought about it for almost the entire piece of pie, and then said that he would like to be Thomas Dugan Weston, if that was permitted, because he wanted to keep his father's name as well. That is absolutely permitted, Jedediah had said. In fact, it is a better solution than the one I offered. Harriet had looked at her son and her husband over the remains of the apple pie, and she had thought, "Earl, we are carrying you with us. We always will." The winter of 1882 was a cold one, the kind of Kansas winter that arrives in October and does not leave until April and makes the house feel very small and the fireplace feel very large. They spent it well. Harriet had put up enough preserves in September to feed a small army, and Flores had constructed a proper root cellar over the fall that held potatoes and onions, and the winter squash she had grown in the East Garden. And the house was warm with the fire, and the work, and the particular kind of interior, whether that exists in a home, where people are genuinely glad to be in each other's company. Jedediah came home on Fridays with the week's accumulated news of Caldwell legal proceedings, the progress of the new land rights bill through the legislature, the state of the new sheriff's administration, which was proving to be considerably more honest than its predecessor, and Harriet listened and asked questions and offered opinions, and he listened to her opinions the way he listened to everything she said, with full attention and without any of the reflexive dismissal that some men applied to the thoughts of women on matters outside the domestic sphere. It was one of the things she had understood about him early and valued more the longer she knew him. In January, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Friday evening after supper, with the fire going and Thomas already in bed, and the snow coming down outside in the straight, determined way of Kansas snow that means business. She told him plainly because she was always plain, and she watched his face while she told him. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it with the same full intention he always brought to holding her hand. And he looked at her with an expression that was layered with things she could see and things she had learned to read in him over these months: joy and careful tenderness and something that looked very much like wonder. "Harriet," he said, "just her name." "I know," she said, smiling. "Are you well? Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am better than I have been in years." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against it, not quite a kiss, more of a holding. His eyes closed for a moment, and she watched him with a fullness in her chest that had been there since August and kept growing. "Thomas will be very surprised," she said. "Thomas," Jedediah said, opening his eyes, "will have an opinion about it and tell us both what it is in considerable detail." She laughed. "He will." Thomas was indeed surprised and did indeed have an opinion. He expressed it the following morning with the careful deliberateness of someone who has stayed up most of the night organizing his thoughts, telling them that he had been thinking about the responsibilities of older siblings and had concluded that they were serious and he was prepared to take them on, provided the new child understood from the beginning that he was in charge of the books. "That seems like a reasonable condition," Jedediah said gravely. Thomas nodded. "Good," he said. "Then I am in agreement." Harriet pressed her lips together very hard to keep from laughing and caught Jedediah's eye over Thomas's head, and he was doing exactly the same thing. And for a moment they were two people held together by shared delight in a child who was so entirely and magnificently himself. The following months moved with the particular quality of time in a life that is full, not slowly but fully, each day containing its proper portion of work and conversation, and the small ordinary pleasures that make up the actual texture of a happy life, as opposed to the dramatic events that mark it. The corn came up in June, better than any season Harriet had managed alone. Flores planted a second field of winter wheat on the south edge of the property that he said would be ready for harvest in the fall and would add meaningfully to their income, and he said it with the quiet pride of a man who has found a place he is good at and intends to stay in it. The creek ran clear all summer. In late August of 1883, Harriet gave birth to a son. They named him Earl Jedediah Weston Earl for his grandfather who had broken the land and held it and died too young to see what it had come to. Jedediah for his father who had made sure it stayed. The birth was uncomplicated, attended by the midwife who served the farms west of Caldwell, a practical woman of middle age named Mrs. Kessler, who had seen rather more dramatic entries into the world, and declared this one among her more pleasant experiences. The baby was red-faced and loud, and had dark hair and a determined expression that Harriet recognized from the first moment she held him as belonging absolutely and uniquely to himself. Thomas appeared at the doorway of the bedroom, while Mrs. Kessler was still cleaning up, with the expression of a person who has received news they were expecting and is assessing the reality against the expectation. He looked at the baby for a long moment. "He is smaller than I thought," Thomas said. "He will grow," Harriet said. "Will he be loud for very long?" "Probably several months," Harriet said honestly. Thomas accepted this with the forbearance of a reasonable person adjusting to new information. "All right," he said. "I can manage that." Jedediah was beside her, his hand in her hair, and she looked up at him, and he was looking at the baby with an expression that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life, raw and complete and unguarded, the expression of a man in the presence of something he has no words for and does not need them. "Earl Jedediah," he said softly. "He has your frown," she said. Jedediah looked at her. "I do not frown." "You absolutely frown," she said. "You frown when you read. It is a thinking frown, but it is still a frown." He looked at the baby again. The baby was frowning at the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is trying to understand it. "I suppose that is acceptable," Jedediah said. The next 2 years settled into the shape of a life that was genuinely good, not without difficulty, because no life on the frontier in the 1880s was without difficulty. Between the weather and the cattle tick outbreaks, and the always shifting economics of the land market, and the cases that came to Jedediah's office that reminded him on a regular basis that the injustice he had built his practice to fight had not diminished. There were families still being pushed off homestead claims by men with lawyers and money, and there were women still bringing children to courthouse steps with deeds in their hands, and hoping for someone who would look at the deed and then look at them and say, plainly and without calculation, "I will help you." He helped all of them he could. Harriet helped him, in the way she helped with everything, not from behind but beside, reading documents, asking questions, noting things that he sometimes missed because she had the perspective of a woman who had been on the other side of exactly that desk and knew what it felt like from there. She had no law degree and would not have been permitted one regardless in 1884, which was an injustice she noted with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a woman who has decided that the things she can change are the ones worth her energy. And she changed what she could, and she named the rest for what it was, and she did not let naming it stop her. Thomas was 10 when little Earl was 2, and 11 when his brother began walking, an event that Thomas regarded with the same focused analysis he brought to everything, and that produced in him a genuine delight, a loosening of his native seriousness that Harriet loved to see. He taught Earl to fish before Earl could properly hold a rod, standing at the creek bank with the 2-year-old's hands in his own, guiding the line over the water in a gesture so exactly like the one Earl Sr. had made with Thomas so many years before that Harriet, watching from the bank, had to press her hand over her mouth. Jedediah came to stand beside her when he saw her expression. He did not say anything. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they watched their boys at the water's edge in the afternoon light. "He does that the same way Earl did," she said quietly, "with Thomas, the same way exactly." "I know," Jedediah said. "Thomas told me. He says he remembers it." She looked at him. "He never told me that. He told me when we were fixing the fence last fall. He said he did not want to make you sad." She was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas and little Earl at the water, the boys' dark hair and the toddlers and the shimmer of the creek beyond them. "He is so much his father's son," she said. "He is," Jedediah agreed, "and entirely his own person at the same time." She looked up at him. "Thank you for that," she said. "For always understanding that." He looked down at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 3 years now and still found things to see in. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said. "Earl Dugan was a good man who loved you and loved this land and made our boy. That is something to be honored. I hope I do it justice." She reached up and touched the side of his face, the gesture she had arrived at sometime in the first year of their marriage as the expression of a particular kind of love, not urgent but deep, the kind that does not need anything from the other person but simply wants them to know they are seen. "You do," she said. In the fall of 1885, the land rights bill that Jedediah had been tracking through the territorial legislature for 3 years finally passed in a form that provided meaningful protections for homestead claims, requiring that any challenge to a federally filed deed had to be brought in territorial court, eliminating the jurisdictional gray area that had allowed men like Rourke to manufacture fraudulent county-level claims. Jedediah had provided testimony to the legislative committee, had corresponded with 4 sympathetic legislators, and had written a legal brief arguing the case for the bill that was circulated among territorial lawyers and cited in the final committee report. When the bill passed, he came home on a Friday evening in September with the telegram announcing it, and read it to Harriet at the kitchen table while little Earl slept, and Thomas sat across from them with his hands folded like a judge awaiting a verdict. Harriet read the telegram herself after Jedediah finished reading it aloud. Then she set it down flat on the kitchen table and pressed her palms over it, and for a moment she was back in that kitchen with the territorial court ruling in front of her, the morning the case had been decided, pressing her palms down on the document as if she needed to feel it was real. "This will protect people," she said. "People like we were." "People like we were," he agreed. Thomas reached over and straightened the telegram on the table, a small, precise gesture. "I am going to be a territorial lawyer," he said, which was not the first time he had said this, but it was the first time he said it in a tone that made it sound not like an aspiration but like a fact. Jedediah looked at him with the expression he reserved for Thomas's most Thomas-like pronouncements. "I believe you," he said. "You will teach me," Thomas said. "I will teach you everything I know," Jedediah said, "and then you will know more than me and you can teach me." Thomas considered this. "That seems efficient," he said. Harriet looked at the two of them across her kitchen table, her firstborn son with Earl's eyes and his own extraordinary mind, her husband with the ink stains that never quite washed off his left hand, and the gray eyes that always told her the truth, the small pile of legal documents between them, and the warm light of the oil lamp over everything. And she held the moment the way she had learned to hold moments, fully and without reaching past them. Because the thing she had learned in all the years since she had forded the creek at dawn with a deed pressed to her chest was that ordinary goodness, the daily accretion of honest work and genuine love and a home that belongs to you, is the thing that everything else is for. Little Earl made a sound from the next room that was the precursor to waking, and she got up and went to him and lifted him from his small bed with the easy warmth of a woman who has carried children long enough that her body remembers it before her mind does. He was heavy and warm, and he clutched at her collar in the absent way of children who grab at the thing nearest to them and hold on, and she stood in the doorway of his room with him against her shoulder and looked back into the kitchen at Thomas and Jedediah, the lamp light and the papers, and the easy companionship of two people who have found their way to each other across the particular distance that law and loss and honest work can create. Jedediah looked up and saw her in the doorway. She smiled at him. He smiled back, the full version, the real one, the one that changed his face completely. Outside, the Kansas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the creek ran its cold, clear course along the western edge of the land that was hers, properly and permanently, and beyond all challenge, and the cottonwoods along its bank moved in the gentle September air, and somewhere out past the dark edge of the world, the cattle trails ran south and the trains ran west and the territory went on and on into its own vastness, and inside the house on the Dugan Weston property, warm and lit and belonging completely to itself, the only sound was the low voices of a man and a boy talking about law and the soft sound of a woman rocking a child who was already going back to sleep. And these sounds were ordinary and whole and entirely enough.